Hello everybody, welcome to this video. It's another in the Student Exemplar series. Now, if I received a penny for every time you guys ask me for videos on Blood Brothers, I'd be a rich man by now. So when this exemplar was sent through, I knew I had to use it. Let's jump right in. Throughout the play Blood Brothers, Russell presents the theme of social class as a driving force behind the storyline, and the main differences between the treatment of the working class, for which the Johnstons are used as a microcosm, and the middle class, represented by the Lyons, are often used to emphasize the very different childhoods of Mickey and Edward. So there's a comprehensive introduction which highlights that key point that what goes on in the play, or in any text, is actually the writer's way of presenting a theme, and here's the theme of social class. Near to the beginning of the play, Mickey, Eddie and Linda go to the park with a toy gun and are shooting at a statue of Peter Pan. Russell has chosen Peter Pan specifically because he's the boy who never grows up, which deliberately creates foreshadowing of the later scene where Mickey says, "While no one was looking, I grew up and you didn't because you didn't have to." This shows the divide in the social classes as Mickey was forced to grow old before his time due to him losing his job while Eddie was off having fun at university. In 1980s Liverpool, unemployment was a big issue due to factories shutting down, where Margaret Thatcher's shutting down many industries caused a lot of unrest in Liverpool as it was a very industrial city, which is why Mickey struggled for a job and became depressed. Russell wanted to present the working class as the victims of society as he grew up in a working class background and wrote the play to change people's attitudes towards them. So here's a nice paragraph which really is structural analysis of foreshadowing, then a nice bit on context and a nice bit on theme. The only way I would have improved this paragraph was to make it clear in my first sentence, in my topic sentence, that it was a structural analysis point. It would have been a bit more sophisticated to say something like, Russell uses the structural device of foreshadowing in the opening of the play, or something like that, just to make it clear to the examiner this is an analysis of structure. Here, the motif of guns is also prevalent, as Russell shows Linda and Mickey as familiar with guns, whereas it is a foreign concept to Edward, as the middle class lead much more sheltered lives. The motif of guns also creates a foreboding atmosphere because the eventual death of Edward and Mickey is by guns. The different treatment of the social classes is presented through the policeman who catches them in the park, about to throw stones through a window. He tells Mrs. Johnston, "You don't want to end up in the courts again, do you?" This rhetorical question seems condescending and threatening, which Russell has used to present the societal attitudes towards the working class. This is developed by the song "We're Moving Away" at the end of Act 1, as the policeman says, "I can safely predict a large drop in the crime rate," which shows that many people believed the working class to be disruptive criminals. Alternatively, a parallel scene is used when the policeman says to Mr. and Mrs. Lyons that it was more of a harmless prank, which shows that the middle class were far more respected. The noun prank has connotations of harmless fun, which directly contrasts with the seriousness of the threat of the justice system to Mrs. Johnston. This emphasizes the differences in the treatment of the two social classes. Now, this is a sort of a paragraph, and we've seen a lot of these in the Student Exemplar series. This is a paragraph that contains lots of different ideas. So it starts off talking about the motif of guns, which goes up to about here. Then there's the treatment of the policeman, and the way the policeman treats the different boys, and a bit of language analysis with the rhetorical question. So we've got a motif of guns and a rhetorical question. Then there's the importance of the song. Then there's the parallel scene and language analysis of the word prank. So there are actually 5 things going on in this paragraph, and for me, and this may be just a personal preference, but I always feel that if you've got lots of ideas in a paragraph, then clearly some of them, if not all of them, are underdeveloped. And I would find myself asking here, what was the point of this paragraph? I thought it was going to be about guns. That's what the topic sentence, the first sentence of the paragraph suggested. And then it moved away to, a song, a rhetorical question, a parallel scene, importance of a noun. So I feel like that paragraph could have been improved, and it's very different to this first paragraph, which actually made one point really well and then linked it to context and theme. This paragraph makes 5 points and doesn't then have the opportunity to link them to context and theme, because They're 5 different points ultimately. Both families move away from their original homes during the play, and through the contrasting scenarios, Russell emphasises the differences in the lives of the social classes. The Johnstons move to 65 Skelmersdale Lane. Skelmersdale was a suburb built to house the former inhabitants of central Liverpool, as building works and new developments were going on in the centre. On the other hand, the Lyons moved house to the countryside by choice. Edward says to Mr. Johnson, "Why don't you just move house?" when she's talking about their council house being too small for all the children. The interrogative question shows that the middle class in 1980s Liverpool were oblivious to the struggles of the working class and did nothing to educate their children to be more understanding about the lives of those less fortunate than themselves. This is presented through the naivety of Edward, and even though he meant no harm, Russell's portrayal of him in this way shows that the middle class took their situation for granted, and arguably still do today, and have no empathy towards the hardship that the working class had to struggle to overcome. Okay, so this paragraph comes back to the more sort of formulaic paragraph approach, which is really good. It's still lacking that topic sentence that really directly says what this paragraph is about. I would have maybe said something like Russell uses setting, or uses symbolism through setting in the play, something like that. But the explanation, the link to context, the sort of bit of language analysis with the interrogative, it's all good. It's interesting, isn't it, how the same student who clearly knows the play very well, knows the themes very well, knows the context very well, has written 3 paragraphs that are so different. One paragraph that's incredibly good, one that is a mixture of lots of different ideas, none of them really explained, and then back to that more sort of solid paragraph. It's very interesting how students so often do this. Okay, moving on then, let's have a look at the next part of the essay. Russell presents marital relationships very differently, and this is instrumental in the overall idea of the class divide as we see 2 very different married couples. Mrs. Johnson says she's got married at the registry, and then we had a do, and then my husband, he walked out on me. The informal language to describe marriage shows that the lives of working class women were like clockwork. They got pregnant young, got married, raised children who eventually did the exact same themselves. This is portrayed through Linda, who gets pregnant at 18 and consequently gets married to Mickey. Okay, so this paragraph, I would have had a topic sentence which said, Russell uses informal language to describe marriage, or something like that, to present marital relationships. When Mickey tells his mother that Linda is pregnant, her immediate response is, "When's the wedding?" which shows that young pregnancy was common amongst the working class at that time. Russell never mentions Mrs. Johnson's first name, which is evidence that she is a microcosm for all the working class. By creating an empathetic connection with the characters, Russell has made the audience become sympathetic towards all the working class, which was his overall aim when he wrote the play. Okay, so I like that paragraph, that's a good paragraph. Mrs. Lyons, however, while in a loveless marriage, is nevertheless referred to as Jennifer or Jen by her husband, showing that she has a much higher status in society than Mrs. Johnson. Women of the middle class were expected to stay at home and look after the children, and the fact that she longs for children so much makes the house seem empty and rather big, too big at the moment actually. They expected children to come along, and since they never did, it is evidence that there is a huge void in her life. The verb expected shows that middle-class people believed that money could get them anything they wanted, and that when things beyond their control got in the way, Mrs. Lyons would just blackmail Mrs. Johnson, again emphasising how she believes she's entitled to what she wants, which was a common attitude of the middle class at the time. Mrs. Johnson uses hyperbole to talk about how if her child was raised in a palace like this one, he'd never have to queue for hours on end at the dole. The noun palace emphasises the difference between the social classes because what seems ordinary to the middle class seems almost out of a fantasy for the working class. In reply, Mrs. Lyons says he will have silver trays to take meals on. The adjective silver has connotations of wealth and extravagancy, which further emphasises the divide between the classes. Some people couldn't afford to eat, and some were rich enough to eat from silver plates. This social injustice was a driving force behind the message that Russell was trying to convey. This shows the different aspirations of the women for their children and how the different classes were commonly treated. In this way, Edward's upbringing is presented very differently to Mickey's, as he has an excess of money from a young age, while the Johnstons struggle to get by day to day. Alternatively, Mrs. Johnson has 7 hungry mouths to feed and jokes that she only has to shake hands and she'll be in the club again. The colloquialism "in the club" to describe pregnancy shows the difference in attitudes of the two women. Russell has made Mrs. Johnson warm and likeable, and this colloquial language makes her more relatable, whereas he has made Mrs. Lyons seem cold and unlikable. We must have this as a binding agreement. The imperative "must" shows her entitled and harsh nature, and the fact that she speaks in received pronunciation. He's done this purposefully as he wants the audience to sympathise with the working-class characters in the play. Mrs. Johnson also seems less educated than Mrs. Lyons due to her use of Liverpudlian dialect. In fact, the education of the two classes is cleverly presented differently by Russell using parallel scenes. There's a scene where Eddie is talking to his headmaster at this boarding school. The headmaster says, "Talk of Oxbridge, I hear," which shows that the aspirations of the middle class were significantly higher than those of the working class, as Eddie goes on to university while Mickey gets a boring, poorly paid factory job, which he eventually loses anyway. The verb "talk" shows that the middle class were open about their high aspirations, whereas the working class were ashamed of their status in society. The middle class didn't care about the suffering of the working class, which is shown by Mrs. Lyons saying it's just another sign of the times. The adverb "just" belittles the plight of the working class and shows that the middle class were oblivious to the hardships of those less fortunate than themselves. Okay, let's pause there for a second. This is a very long answer, 1,875 words, and I'm sure a lot of you would think you wouldn't be able to write that in the exam time, but it goes to show if you do really focus and know your text really well, you'll find you can write a lot more than if you don't. I actually think that this is becoming quite repetitive in what the student is doing in the single word class analysis, so the adverb, the verb, the adjective. I would try to make points on language and structure and form, and the structure point is hinted at here because there's this mention of parallel scenes. So I would just make the essay, or this part of the answer, more focused on the importance of the parallel scenes and the fact that they're placed next to each other and why that is significant, rather than get into the close word analysis, which has been so much a staple of the answer. I feel like the student has demonstrated that they're good at language analysis, and it would be a good point to move forward and actually analyse structure. In the subsequent scene, the headmaster becomes the teacher at Mickey's school, who says to the one child who is trying to do well, "Oh, shut up, Perkins, you boring turd." Mickey is not concerned with his education, as he says, "How's knowing what some sodding pygmies had for their dinner going to help me get a job?" This shows that from a young age, the working class are indoctrinated with the idea that the only path for them is to get out of school and get a job. Russell grew up in a working class background, but eventually became middle class as he did well for himself, so he knows what it was like to grow up in a similar situation to Mickey, which is why the class divide is such a key topic in the play. Therefore, the way Russell has the narrator end the play, who plays many characters throughout the play, representing a microcosm for all of society's attitudes and the stereotypical 1980s prejudice ideas about the working class, links to how at the start he introduces Mrs. Johnson as having a stone in place of her heart, which throughout the play we come to disagree with. So by the end of the play, we as an audience disagree with him, therefore the typical prejudices against the working class, which was exactly Russell's intention. He says, was it really Mrs. Johnson's fault that the boys died as they did, or is it the fault of what we, the British, have come to know as class? By concluding the play with the collective pronoun we, he's successful in creating an accurate portrayal of far more than a tragic tale of two brothers. He creates a moving story about a society, our society, which is so harshly defined by social class. In this way, he makes us think about how we treat each other in a modern society, and why this class divide is so prominent even now, after all this time. So this final paragraph's interesting because, like that second paragraph, it's got a lot of different ideas in it which I feel are underdeveloped, and that may well just be the exam. The students running out of time and they think, oh, I've got these 2 or 3 more things that I want to say, I better quickly just rush them in here. It would have been good, I think, to actually not have all of that close language word analysis and to have some time for more of these ideas. I love the idea of the importance of the narrator playing many characters, is underdeveloped in this answer. So lots of strengths, a couple of ways to improve. If you enjoyed the video, please do subscribe to the channel.